my next guest is a true trailblazer who has inspired me over the years. She is somebody who has dedicated her life to activism and focusing on Asian American issues and telling the stories that need to be told. Helen Zia is with me now. Helen, so good to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Maylee.
And I'm going to just tell people who may not know your full background, just a little bit about what you've done. You are an award-winning journalist, activist, author. You've written a couple of books, one that just came out recently that we'll talk about. She has walked the walk. She's dedicated her life to shedding light on these issues that we care about, from human rights and peace, women's rights, LGBTQ, and talking about hate crimes, which, you know, we've been dealing with for decades and still do to this day. So a lot of things that Helen has done in her life, she has committed to fully, and made people aware of what's going on and what we need to talk about. So Helen, I first want to say we go way back. Okay.
Yeah, we sure do.
We go way back. Now, not in a, you know, it's not like we've kept in touch or anything, but I got to tell you, 20 years ago, I interviewed you when you wrote your first book, Asian American Dreams, right? That's when I was working for Oxygen, which was the Oprah Winfrey channel in New York, but it was 20 years ago. Can you believe it?
No, I really can't. But I have to say, those brain cells are, you know, I really have to dig deep to get them activated. Yeah.
Well, this book that I'm holding up to everyone who's listening, I'm holding up her book right now, Asian American Dreams. And this is the actual book that I got to read before the interview. And I have had it for 20 years. And you guys, you gotta understand, I've moved all over the world and I have had this book this whole time.
That's hard to believe. I mean, you know, books are pretty tough to haul around.
They are.
But I'm honored that you did.
But this one struck me because of what you were talking about. And it was all about the Asian American experience, the hardships and the stories that every one of us have to tell in our families. But let's first talk about, you know, your work and why you've been so committed to digging deeper into the Asian American history, Asian American stories, and still fighting this fight after all these years. What was it for you that drove you to really commit to these issues?
I think part of it is being the daughter of immigrants myself. My parents were from China. I grew up at a time when, especially I didn't grow up in a Chinatown.
Right.
And beyond the borders of Chinatowns are little Tokyos or little Manilas and, you know, ghettos that Asian Americans were relegated to. If you didn't grow up there, you were not only an alien in citizenship terms, but you were an alien from Mars.
Yeah.
And wherever you went, people would stop and stare at you in the most kind of mean-spirited way. And as a kid, of course I remember that and just felt completely invisible. And so,
like a freak, like you said. Right. I mean, I've had those experiences too when I was a kid where people would look at me like I had three heads.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you were either invisible or you were not human.
Yeah.
And so with that, I think stories made a big impact on me. And I began to realize, you know what? People, if they don't see us, they have to see us. We're here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not go back where you came from. I came from New Jersey.
Right.
Hello, I don't want to go back there.
How many times have we heard that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think as I became aware that I wanted to write and tell stories, you know, I was aware that other people were invisible too. I wanted to tell the stories of all invisible people.
Right.
And the first, I would say 10 or 20 years of my journalism career, I wrote almost nothing about Asian Americans because, you know, my editors weren't interested in that. So even in my own journalism career, we were invisible. Then I was very aware of that. And I kept track of the stories that were happening that I thought should be reported on. And it was at that point when I was like, I have to write a book about this. You know, we're just repeating history now. Now the hate crimes are happening again, the political hysteria coming out of Washington that we're also seeing today with the coronavirus and, you know, the China haters in the world and everything bad that's happening to the United States is coming out of Asia.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when any country in Asia catches a cold, Asians in America catch pneumonia. and now it's coronavirus,
Yeah.
and so
We'll definitely get more into what's going on with that and how that seems like history is repeating itself to a certain extent.
absolutely. So it was that made me feel like, okay, if I'm a writer and I want to tell stories of people who don't get their stories told, what about my own community and the experiences that I've known for a lifetime
Right.
and the people that I know around me?
But were you fearful at that time that nobody would actually want to even read these stories, even if you wrote about them, that there would be no interest? I mean, what was the reaction?
Well, you know what? I knew that within our communities, people would want to read them. And
Okay.
I really just believed that, it's part of the American experience,
Yeah.
part of the human experience. But to your point, in trying to get a book published, the
Yeah.
kind of things that people would say is like, oh, well, do these people even read English? These people being
Oh,
Asian
man.
Americans. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, well, excuse me, but they're in America.
Yeah.
They're Americans. And yes,
Mhm.
they read English, and so that was a constant thing to have to try to navigate,
Well, I'll tell you something, Helen.
My brother's name is, one of my brothers is Henry. So.
Okay. Hi, Henry. But Helen, when I pitched this to my executive producer on Oxygen, at first she was not interested.
Mhm.
And I had to convince the team
Wow.
to do this interview because it meant so much to me.
And this is Oprah Winfrey's.
Yeah, but Oprah had nothing to do with the
okay.
decision making on a daily
Right,
basis, so can't blame her per se. But
Okay.
but the team, the daily team that ran the show,
Yeah.
and so I just felt like, God, that's so offensive, right? Because I'm an Asian asking you, please, let's do this interview because it's important to me and these are important
And because
stories.
about the community.
Yes,
and you
exactly.
realize it's
Right.
important,
But
even though they might not.
There was resistance.
That's
There was resistance, but I fought it. I won. But I know that it was forced. So back then, there was no interest. And I got to be honest with you, Helen, I still think even now there's a lack of interest compared to other types of stories and other communities.
Oh, I think that's totally true. I mean, and not only that, where there is awareness
Yeah.
that, the Pacific Ocean exists and there's something beyond in that direction,
Right.
it's pretty negative. I mean, I think we're in a very kind of down spiral time where, now there's an awareness and they're all bad. All those people
all
over
bad.
there, they're disease carriers. They're the enemy. They are the worst.
They're taking our jobs and
They're
all
the
that stuff.
existential threat
Right.
to America as we know it.
Right. I think it's interesting, Helen, because I think about my experiences growing up with, feeling like the other and the outsider.
And where was that? Maybe?
Ohio.
Ah, sure.
Ohio, in the 70s. So, as you can imagine, it was challenging at times. But I really think that it made an impact that was so deep-seated that it led me to become a journalist, because I think I developed this incredible sense of justice, right? And speaking out for those who didn't have a voice. And now I reflect on, how that shaped me in a very powerful way. Maybe I didn't know it at the time and I hated it and, I was miserable, but it really is interesting how that empowered me in many ways to become the person I am.
Well, I identify with what you said and your experience very much. I think that was true. And, there wasn't a strong voice for Asian Americans at the time. I mean, there was nobody with a byline or on the evening news ever.
Yeah.
And so when the civil rights movement and the African American movements happened around the country with people standing up and saying, we have to stand up for our rights. I mean, it very much resonated because,
Right.
we could see that as Asian Americans, I could see that we were completely invisible and that if we didn't speak up, nobody would.
Right.
So that was a very important lesson too, even though it wasn't Asian Americans.
Yeah.
And I think that was true for really, an entire generation of Asian Americans, seeing like that we have lessons to learn from the civil rights movement mainly of African Americans.
And we also have lessons to learn of our own history, Asian American history. And, a lot of our listeners and viewers are from the younger side of the Asian American community. And I know that probably a lot of them don't know about Vincent Chin. And that is a story that everyone should know about, especially if you're Asian American. And this is a story that impacted you because you covered it, but also were there in Detroit when it all happened.
Right.
So let's talk about Vincent Chin for a second, because this is a story that impacted me very deeply when it happened. And this is something that should resonate even now because of what's happening in our country. Vincent Chin was living in Detroit at the time when the auto industry was collapsing. So all the U.S. automakers were just being obliterated and people were being laid off left and right because of the Japanese auto company autos were doing much better. So there was a lot of obviously disgruntled people in Detroit, especially at the time.
Right.
And then Vincent Chin, you can pick up the story from there. He's a Chinese American guy. Not Japanese.
Right. Not Japanese. And so we're talking about the collapse of not just the auto industry, but the entire manufacturing sector of America.
Right.
Was affected by these big dinosaurs that got 9 miles a gallon or less.
Right.
Suddenly weren't selling at all.
Right.
And so we had this whole industry where millions of people were dependent on it, were unemployed. And as you say, they blamed the cars that were fuel efficient.
Yeah.
Well, that included cars from Germany, but the German people and people who looked like them weren't attacked. But Japan was suddenly labeled as the enemy. And in the airwaves, in the halls of Washington, in the corporate, C-suites, all they could say was, Japan is the enemy. This is war.
Yeah.
This is war. We should send another atomic bomb to Japan. We should, annihilate these people.
They weren't holding back with their rhetoric.
No. And so the rhetoric was all about, let's kill them.
Yeah.
Because that's what war is about.
Right.
And so for Asian Americans, Chinese Americans like Vincent Chin, who was raised and grew up in Detroit, this rhetoric became personal. People would look, in fact, if you drove a Japanese model car in Detroit, you could get shot at on the freeway.
Mm-hmm.
And so look out if you have an Asian face.
Yeah.
And so Vincent Chin was about to get married. And so on his all-American bachelor party, he went out with a bunch of his best buddies to, a pretty sleazy bar.
Mm-hmm.
And while they're at the bar, the two white guys sit there, see them having a good time. And one of them says, it's because of you MFs that we're out of work.
Yeah.
Now, one of his buddies says, well, hey, he's Chinese. He's not Japanese. It didn't matter.
Didn't matter.
He looked Japanese.
Didn't matter. Yep.
And so,
these two men had been laid off, right? Were they not part of they just wanted to.
In fact, one of them, people think that, auto workers, uneducated, whatever. One of them was the plant superintendent of a Chrysler plant. So this guy had a lot of responsibility, and he was the one who actually then, if you can imagine, those are fighting words.
Yeah.
And so Vincent and his friends, there was a fight that, happened at the bar. They were all kicked out of the bar. And then these two white men.
They were chased, right?
Couldn't let it go.
Yeah.
They got a bat out of the car.
Vincent, a baseball bat. This was brutal.
Right.
Yeah.
And Vincent so this is a mixed group.
It was two Asians and then other white guys in the bachelor party,
white guys.
right?
And so these two killers go after Vincent and his Chinese,
of course,
buddy.
Yeah. So clearly, the reason why they were targeted was because of exactly what we're talking about.
Absolutely, they didn't care about his white friends,
right? So
Vincent and his friend Jimmy take off.
Yeah,
they start running because they said, "We're not going to fight you with a bat."
Yeah.
And so they were younger, they were faster, they got away. But these two guys were so intent on it, they actually hired, an African-American man in the neighborhood and said, help me find the Chinese guys. I'm sure it was more than
it was
that.
Chink, I'm sure. Right. Yeah.
So they go driving through the streets of Detroit in the neighborhood, and lo and behold, Vincent and his friend are sitting on a curb waiting for a bus to get away in front of an incredibly crowded
so there were a lot of people around, a lot of witnesses.
Probably 70 or 80 or 100 witnesses because there had been a Tigers game that night. The streets were packed.
Yeah.
People were leaving the stadium, and anyway, they snuck up behind Vincent, and by the time the two, Vincent and his friends saw them coming, it was too late.
It's too
Vincent
late,
jumped up and started to run and tripped. The younger guy, white guy, grabs
Grabbed
him,
him, yeah.
and the older guy who has the bat, who is the plant superintendent, takes the bat and starts, according to one witness, swinging at his head like he was going for a home run. And 2 off-duty police officers were there on the scene. Too late, but they, by the time they got there and ordered the killer to stop, Vincent, they
Vincent
said
was dead, yeah.
his brains were on the street.
Yeah, I mean, we have
to.
to emphasize the violence of this crime. I don't want to be too gruesome, but his head was literally it was like a melon that was bashed
Absolutely.
into pieces.
Right.
That's how
Right.
violent this
Right.
murder was.
Right.
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 And so, of course, let's cut to what ended up happening to these two gentlemen.
Well,
I can't even use, why am I calling them gentlemen?
Yeah,
No,
well.
they're not gentlemen. Sorry.
no.
Savages. Yeah.
These killers.
Yeah.
And so fast forward, Vincent was a goner that night. Actually, that's what the EMT on the scene said. It was obvious he wasn't going to make it. And so Vincent's 450 wedding guests went to his funeral instead. And I remember seeing the headlines about this terrible crime. There were no witnesses that were interviewed at the time. And so we didn't know whether it was a racist hate crime.
Mm.
But for me, being Asian American, I just knew, well, first of all, there weren't a lot of Asians in Detroit at the time. And with the knowledge that if you had an Asian face, you were a walking target.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knew that.
Right.
I just had a feeling. And I was a baby journalist then.
Yeah.
I was just beginning. I clipped out that article and kept it because I said, I want to keep an eye on this. 9 months later, it makes its way through the court system. The killers were, there was no question that they had killed Vincent Chin.
Right.
And so they were up for sentencing. And the judge said, well, you don't look like the kind of men who should go to jail. Now, imagine that in a city like Detroit that was, 60 to 70% African-American.
Right.
Well, okay, who do you send to jail?
Right.
But the judge sentences them to probation.
Probation.
So they never spent a day in jail.
Right.
Gives them a fine of $3,000, which, the headlines after that was like, that's cheaper than a used car.
Yeah.
The value they put on this Chinese American's life was less than a used car.
Yeah. And not one day in jail.
And not one day in jail. And the whole, not just Asian Americans, the whole community rose up.
Yeah.
I mean, Black, white, Asian, it's like, what? The cost of a terrible beating death
Right.
is nothing. You get to walk scot-free. So there was a lot. And to say, you're not the kind who should go to jail.
Right. So it was a clearly very racist, elitist kind of decision.
Right. So columnists wrote about that, saying, well, like, what kind of comment is this about our criminal justice system? So the Asian American community was like, you know what? If a man could get away with killing Vincent Chin like that, what does that mean for our whole community? And not just in Detroit, but around the country, because this hysteria against Asian Americans and Japanese who look Japanese was all over the country.
And this did really galvanize the community.
Oh, it completely did.
It changed the trajectory and really brought people together to say, wait a minute, this is a momentous, incident that we need to speak out about and do something about.
Right. Because up until that point, the Asian American community wasn't even Asian American. It was, in the sense, it was your Japanese American, your Chinese American, Filipino, Indian, Korean. Everybody was their own little ethnic community.
Right.
And there were no national advocacy groups, nobody to stand up about hate crimes. But here was a Chinese who was killed because he looked Japanese.
Right.
And so it actually became, it was covered internationally.
Yeah.
In Japan, China, elsewhere.
And a documentary was made on who killed Vincent Chin.
Was made,
yeah.
But it galvanized people.
Yeah.
So communities that had never really talked to each other or done any kind of work together came together literally to talk about racism toward Asian Americans. And
so that
had never happened.
Yeah.
before.
So it's almost as if that was a really important juncture for the Asian American movement. right?
It was the first mass community, Pan-Asian coming together
Right.
for a political reason.
Right, right.
There were, there had been student movements before, the Asian American Studies movement. That was college students.
Yes.
That was, and
Right.
not to take anything away from that, that was incredibly important. But on a mass community level,
Mhm.
where you had waiters and cooks and laundry people who were out on the streets carrying banners and pushing people in wheelchairs and baby carriages
Yeah.
alongside engineers and scientists, speaking different dialects,
Right.
as well as, just the Pan-Asian community and Black, white, every religion.
And I mean, we have to remember that back then, Asians were still not speaking out about much.
Oh.
They were still kind of doing the head down, keep quiet, do your thing, don't get involved. That's, that kind of attitude, right?
Right.
But this obviously changed things.
It changed things. And that was part for the young activists out there, people who want to make a change.
Yeah.
It didn't just magically happen. We had to do the footwork, the face-to-face talking with people,
Yeah.
having community meetings where people would get up and say, I've spent all my life swallowing the racism that I've experienced at work. I've never gotten a promotion, and I've trained every, fresh out of college, kid to be my supervisor.
Yeah.
And I never said a word, but now I have to speak up. So they would say things like that. And other ones would ask questions like, if we speak up, is that going to bring more trouble on our communities? Isn't it better to just keep our heads down? Don't
quiet.
make waves.
Don't make waves. Well, that's why the model minority myth, right,
That's
exists.
partly where it comes from. And certainly people were worrying that if we spoke up, were we going to be seen like the bad minority, which is sort of like the model minority and the bad minority.
Yeah.
So who's the bad minority?
Right.
So we had to talk about that in community meetings and say, no, if we don't speak up, there will be more trouble, because people can think that they can completely push us around and even kill us and with no consequences.
No recourse. Yeah, exactly.
And unfortunately, there's still many who believe that today, not only within the Asian community, but many who are not, who think, well, we can push those Asians around because nothing's going to happen and they won't fight back.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that still exists today.
Oh, I think it still does. And I mean, I think that's why you're seeing these, still seeing some sort of movement trying to be accelerated within our communities into the mainstream, right? There's improvement, but then it's kind of shocking when you think back to when that happened in the 80s to where we are now.
Right.
And it seems like, yes, there's been progress, and yet I still look around and I'm like, man, there's still so much work to do.
There's so much work to do, but there has been progress. I mean, out of the Vincent Chin case, that motivated communities across the country to create, advocacy groups, to stand up, to say, if a hate crime happens here, who can we go to?
Yeah.
Whole generations of young activists, lawyers have come out partly because of this case. And look, we're sitting here with your podcast.
Exactly.
And
this wouldn't have worked, I think, even, 5 years ago. I have to be honest, just because I think there was still some resistance in terms of speaking out very openly and authentically and tackling sometimes issues that we don't even want to talk about. Right. So that's always been the problem in the past, where even within the Asian community, if we don't want to talk about these difficult issues, then why the hell should anyone else care?
Right.
Right. So there is a growing boldness, I think, that has been developing, which makes me happy to see. Right. And if we can continue facilitating it, then that's, I'm more than happy to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we have no choice.
No.
It's not like we can dig a hole in the ground and hide our heads like an ostrich, because you know what? We can still be targets, and that's,
we still are at times. Yeah.
There's no choice. And, and unlike back in the 1980s, that ancient history period, our communities have more than 10 times, or 10 times, even more than 10 times larger. We have more than 20 million Asian Americans. We're still the fastest growing, so-called minority group in the country. And within a very short period of time, people of color are going to be the majority in the United States, and with a large population of Asian Americans.
Right.
the only people who are going to speak up for us are ourselves.
Right.
So we either be invisible and experience the kind of things that happened to Vincent Chin and before that, or we stand up and claim our rightful place and insist on our histories and our stories being told.
Well, I was just going to say that all comes through storytelling, right? And
Right.
controlling that narrative so that we can tell these authentic, very genuine stories. Helen, let me switch gears for a second. You are also openly gay. I know that's kind of a pivot right now, but I think that's an important thing to talk about, especially in the Asian American community, because you are also a champion of LGBTQ issues and rights. But for a long time, you were in the closet because, you weren't going to be accepted because it was considered taboo, particularly in the Asian community. I'm curious about, what that process was like for you. Was it like a long-standing internal struggle? I mean, I know coming out to your family, that probably wasn't easy either.
No, not for anybody.
Not for anybody,
And so I would say I was in the closet to myself for a long time.
Okay.
Because, even as a young activist, when I was, even before I went to Detroit, I had been a construction worker. I was doing community organizing. I was working with fellow activists from the Asian and Black and Puerto Rican communities in Boston after I quit medical school.
Yeah.
And there was a time when we had a trial because I was very active in the burgeoning women's movement in the Boston area. We would have meetings where 300 women from all over the metropolitan area would come to a meeting, and we would talk about women's issues. And a very small percentage of those women were lesbians. And so I would be part of that women's organizing in the Boston Women's Union then. And then I would also do things, in the Chinatown and South End, community that I lived in.
Yep.
That was mostly people of color. And so at one of the meetings, I was invited to a meeting with my fellow activists of color.
Okay.
And when I got there, I didn't know what the topic was. Well, it turns out I was the topic. And they had me sit in the middle of all of them around a semicircle, and it turned into a trial.
Wow.
And they said, well, Helen, we've noticed you're around a lot of women, around a lot of lesbians, as though all of the women were lesbians. But, that's another, stereotype for feminists.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, so they kind of read the charges like, well, in the African American community, there are no homosexuals. and, it's a white thing, and we wouldn't want you to be involved at all. And, and the Asian American activists said, that's right. It's being gay, or actually, I think they probably said homosexuality is a white, petty bourgeois disease. It's decadence, and it's not acceptable.
Fascinating.
And it would ruin our organizing efforts.
Wow.
So if you are, we wouldn't want to have you be any part of our organizing, our community. And this is my community. And
so did they point blank ask you, are you gay?
Yes. They said, so Helen, tell us, are you a lesbian?
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's amazing. Okay.
Now, at the time, I was what young people today have. They actually have places they can go, and they're considered questioning, where they can just, explore and wonder, what does it mean? Could I be gay?
Right.
Or, what? And, but that didn't exist back then. And so in my head, quickly, I'm like, so Helen, are you gay? And I'm like, am I gay? I don't know. I didn't have a girlfriend. I didn't have the membership card that Ellen, said. I didn't get the toaster oven. And so, but I knew they were saying if I was, I would be expelled. Yeah. I would be excommunicated from communities of color. And so I said, no, I'm not.
Okay.
And so for myself, that was like stepping into the closet for myself. And I just didn't want to okay, la, la, la. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about this.
Okay.
And conveniently, I moved to Detroit just to get away too, because it just felt too uncomfortable. I couldn't be around.
So did that allow you, the physical move allow you to be more open or explore?
No. It allowed me to be more in the closet because first of all, I stopped even seeing my friends, my women friends in the women's movement at that point. And it was a terrible conflicted time
That
for
must
me.
have been a lonely experience for you then.
It was a sad experience. And
yeah.
I didn't have the words or the, there weren't books about these, that I could find or stories. Certainly it was an invisible issue, in the media for me. And so anyway, pick up and leave. And in a way that's, you never know what your journey will lead to. And that's how I ended up being in Detroit, at the time that Vincent Chin was killed.
Right.
And the collapse of the auto industry. So, and then to be part of that movement. But of course, I wasn't out then. And I just never talked about my personal life. There was nothing to say. I was just too hidden about it. I didn't know what to say about it myself. So eventually I moved, I became a journalist and I realized I was a lesbian and I fell in love with a woman. And so that was then the question of how do I tell this world where I'm going to be expelled from the community that now I was very deeply involved in because of the national movement of the, this national Asian American movement. And I could never forget being told if you are one of those horrible things, you'll be expelled.
Yeah.
So first I did come out to my family. Of course, that was the most important thing.
And how were they?
Well, like a lot of gay people, gay and lesbian people, or trans people, I kind of strategized that. And I told my sister first.
Okay.
And I told my sister, and of course we're very close. And my sister was like, oh, okay.
Okay.
And I kind of think she told my mother before I did.
Oh, she did. Okay.
I'm sure.
Just to kind of soften her.
We're not good at secrets in my family. and so, but soon I told my mother and she was like, yeah, okay. Yeah. I sort of knew already.
Okay.
And then she proceeded to tell me that she knew of lesbians, but her English was not perfect. And she said, I knew lesbies when I was a girl growing up in Shanghai. And that was one of the stories she told me. And actually those lesbies appear in my book too.
Really?
The Last Boat Out of Shanghai. So that was great. My family embraced me.
That's great.
It wasn't an issue at all.
Yeah.
And
that must have been a relief.
Oh, completely.
Yeah. And did you then feel more fully yourself? So because you didn't have the secret and you weren't trying to withhold your full self?
Well, yes, to my family.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge part of it. The people who were closest to me, of course, that wasn't no longer, a fear that I had to carry with me. Right. But I still had the fear of the community and how they would respond. And when you go to work and everybody's talking about what they did over the weekend and, what they saw and who they had dinner with, it's the kind of thing I wanted to bring my whole self into my work too. And it, as a writer, as an editor, it's like, it's how do I bring a whole worldview into, the kind of writing I was doing.
Right.
And so then it became a question of how do I come out to the community? And I actually ended up when I had to give a talk at a journalism convention. And this was a time during the 1990 presidential election. There was during that election cycle, there was all this terrible homophobic stuff. It was coming, during the HIV epidemic that happened. And there was all this anti-gay stuff about wanting to outlaw us. And the whole mantra was come out if you can. Come out. And I worked at Ms. Magazine. I was out there. I didn't have to worry about losing my job like a lot of people did at that time.
Right.
And so I thought, okay, here's this conference. I have to give a talk to this whole thing. It was being televised by C-SPAN.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, okay, this is it. But I had a 10-minute talk about stereotypes of Asian Americans. And I worked all night trying to think how I could put this in my talk, and I couldn't fit. It couldn't fit. Oh, no. And Leah, who is now my wife, but Leah said, "Why don't you put it in your introduction? Have the introducer do it."
Oh, so I thought, put it on the no.
Yeah. So I thought, great idea. So I wrote on a Post-it. Helen is a lesbian.
No.
I did. On a
Post-it.
My
God.
And so I saw the introducer, Haley Sterling, and I said, he was a broadcaster. And I said, Haley, could you add this to your introduction? she looks at the Post-it and she says, "Oh yeah, okay." And she, so as she's doing the introduction, she says, and Helen Zia is a journalist. She's an editor. She's a community activist, and she's a lesbian. And then she goes, to the mic.
No.
Did you hear that? She's a lesbian.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
And I was like, oh, okay. I never asked her if she had ever said this word in public before. and the whole goal was to let people know. So,
Wow.
And so that's how I came. But part of the idea was that, we're invisible. So the invisibility of Asian Americans, but even in our Asian American communities, there are people who are invisible.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
this whole notion that there are no, queer people, LGBTQ people.
Of color. I mean, that's
color
ridiculous.
Anywhere,
Yeah.
or even in Japan, in
Exactly.
the continent of Africa.
Right.
The leaders have said that.
Yeah.
And so the feeling that if we could be visible, we had to be. And
Right.
so,
right. And again, so you were a trailblazer on that front as well, for doing that.
When Leah and I could finally
Get married
legally in 2008, I was
Yeah.
asked, would you mind if a couple reporters were there? Well, as it turns out, we were in the first group to get married.
in California.
In California.
Right? Yep.
And so so there was a whole bunch of camera crew and reporters who completely edged out our friends who were there and our guests and stuff, which had I had any idea like how mobbed it would be, we would have set up something.
Yeah.
So our friends could be up front.
But it was a big
so
deal.
it was there. They interviewed my mother so the Chinese media was there too.
Oh.
The Chinese language media, and they interviewed my mother in Mandarin and in Cantonese.
Okay.
And so the entire, Mandarin and Cantonese speaking world could see this. It's still on YouTube, where they interview my mother and they ask her, so how do you feel that your daughter is marrying another woman? And my sweet, dear mother says, I'm almost 80 years old. I have 6 children. And now I can say all of my children are happily married with families of their own.
Oh.
I'm very happy.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, this is the kind, who can argue with that?
No.
What mother or father doesn't want their kids to be in a
Happy.
happy, healthy family relationship?
Yeah.
And so my mother says
gosh.
this in Chinese, and it's just beautiful.
I love that. I love that story. I've never read about this story actually, about how you came out at this convention. So yeah, that's a terrific story. Helen, I know you're tight on time because she's here in Southern California because she's doing several different events, promoting her book, but also obviously talking about these issues. But I could talk for hours with you. And again, I really mean this. I mean, you have really inspired me for decades.
Thank you,
with the work that you've done and you continue to do. And that's what inspires me even more. When you find that passion, that something you truly believe in, you'll do whatever it takes to keep it going. And that's what you've proven to all of us.
Well, I think we're sisters in this, Maeve. I mean, you
I
are
think we
definitely
are.
doing this too.
Yeah. You know what? I want to read one passage from your book that I had highlighted back then.
Wow.
It says, but we've pushed open the door and moved inside. We're out of the shadows and into the light. With 10 million of us at the dawn of the millennium, there's no back to send us to. History, demographics, and our determination are on our side. What we have learned can't be taken away. We will be full partners in the future of America. I love that. And that was 20 years ago when you wrote this. And, it can still be said today that we're still pushing forward, and want to be part of this country that we are truly Americans. Right?
And it is our rightful place.
It's our rightful
helped
place.
build this country too. And that really needs to be recognized. Thank you for what you're doing to get these stories told.
It's my pleasure, and I'm thrilled that people are responding to it. So thank you for sharing your story with me after 20 years. So good to see you, Helen.
Great to see you again too, May.
I want to keep it. Let's not make it another 20 years, okay?
Definitely.